The morning of October 24th, 1944, broke over the Philippine Sea with an unsettling stillness. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most decorated fighter aces with 64 confirmed kills, sat in the cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M0 at Clark Field on Luzon. His hands rested on the control stick, familiar and worn smooth from years of combat. Through the plexiglass canopy, he watched ground crews fuel the remaining aircraft of the 201st Air Group, their movements slow, almost reluctant. The base had been hammered by American raids for weeks. Craters pockmarked the runway. Spare parts were non-existent, and yet headquarters insisted the Americans could still be stopped. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sakai had flown since China in 1937. He had seen Pearl Harbor's aftermath, tangled with wildcats over Guadalcanal, and survived a devastating head wound that cost him vision in one eye. But this morning felt different. The radio chatter from the fleet spoke of massive American naval forces converging on Leyte Gulf: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and carriers. Always carriers, yet the intelligence reports carried a dismissive tone that troubled him. Most of the American carriers spotted were small, auxiliaries, escort types, baby flat tops, the staff officers called them, not fleet carriers, not the Essex-class behemoths, just converted merchant hulls, slow and lightly armed, useful only for ferrying planes or screening convoys. The briefing officer that morning had been explicit. These escort carriers pose minimal threat to our operations. They lack the aircraft capacity and speed of true fleet carriers. Our concern remains the main American carrier groups positioned east of the Philippines. Sakai had nodded along with the others, but something gnawed at him. He had learned in 7 years of air combat never to underestimate an enemy's creativity. The Americans had surprised them before with radar, with tactics, with industrial might that seemed to conjure fleets from nowhere. Still, doctrine was doctrine. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its entire strategy around engaging enemy fleet carriers in decisive battle. Auxiliary ships were afterthoughts, logistics vessels that kept the real warships supplied. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By mid-morning, Sakai's squadron received orders to conduct armed reconnaissance over the waters east of Samar. American invasion forces had been landing on Leyte for days, and Admiral Takeo Kurita's powerful center force was steaming through San Bernardino Strait to attack the beachhead. Sakai's mission was to locate and report American carrier positions, engage targets of opportunity, and return to base. Simple enough, on paper, but the fuel situation meant this would likely be a one-way flight for some. He pushed the thought aside and focused on the pre-flight checklist. The Zero climbed into hazy tropical air, joining 11 others in loose formation. They flew east, skimming over jungle canopy that gave way to brilliant blue ocean. Sakai scanned the horizon methodically, his good eye compensating for the blind spot on his left. The sea below appeared empty at first, just the endless Pacific stretching toward the rising sun. Then, at 10,000 feet, his wingman's voice crackled over the radio. Small ships ahead, bearing 090. Multiple contacts. Sakai banked slightly and looked where indicated. There, perhaps 20 miles distant, a cluster of vessels moved slowly northward. Even at this distance, they looked unimpressive. Small, boxy silhouettes with flat decks, no sweeping lines of a fleet carrier, no towering island superstructures like Shokaku or Zuikaku. These were escort carriers, exactly as intelligence had described. Merchant hulls converted to carry perhaps 20 or 30 aircraft. Sakai had seen similar ships before, always far from the action, always peripheral. He keyed his radio. Confirmed. Enemy escort carriers. Approximately 6 vessels with destroyer screen, continuing reconnaissance. What happened next would shatter every assumption Sakai and his fellow pilots held about American naval aviation. As the Zero formation descended to investigate, The small carriers below erupted with activity. Aircraft began launching from their decks, not the lumbering torpedo bombers or scout planes one might expect from auxiliary vessels, but fighters. Grumman F-6F Hellcats, dozens of them, climbing rapidly into defensive positions. Sakai felt his stomach tighten. Hellcats from escort carriers? That made no tactical sense. The Hellcat was a frontline fighter, heavy, powerful, designed to counter the Zero in direct combat. It required substantial deck space for takeoff and landing. These tiny ships shouldn't be able to operate such aircraft effectively. Yet there they were, rising like hornets from a disturbed nest, their distinctive profiles unmistakable against the white clouds. The American pilots formed up with practiced efficiency, establishing a defensive perimeter around the small carriers. Sakai counted at least 30 fighters airborne within minutes, with more launching continuously. His formation leader ordered the squadron to climb and assess the situation. But already, Sakai understood they had stumbled into something unexpected. These weren't auxiliary vessels waiting passively for protection. They were active combat platforms, bristling with air power. The engagement that followed was brief and brutal. Sakai's squadron attempted to break through the Hellcat screen to strike at the carriers themselves, but the American fighters intercepted with aggressive tactics. The Hellcats used altitude and speed advantages ruthlessly, diving on the Zeros from above, firing bursts from their .650 caliber machine guns, then climbing away before the more maneuverable Japanese fighters could respond. It was textbook boom and zoom fighting, the exact counter to the Zero's strengths. Sakai managed to evade 2 attacking Hellcats by executing a sharp split-S maneuver, but watched helplessly as 3 of his squadron mates were shot down in flames. The remaining Zero scattered, pursued by relentless American fighters who seemed to have endless numbers. Sakai limped back to Clark Field alone, his Zero riddled with bullet holes, fuel gauge hovering near empty. When he climbed from the cockpit, hands shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion, the ground crew stared at the damage in silence. In the debriefing room, Sakai filed his report with as much detail as memory allowed. The intelligence officer, a young lieutenant commander who had never flown combat, listened with visible skepticism. "You're certain these were escort carriers? Not fleet carriers misidentified?" Sakai's jaw tightened. "I have been flying for 7 years. I know the difference between a fleet carrier and an escort carrier. These were small ships, perhaps 500 feet long, maybe 10,000 tons displacement. But they launched Hellcats, many Hellcats, and those fighters operated with complete coordination." The intelligence officer made notes, but his expression remained doubtful. "Our doctrine does not account for escort carriers functioning as offensive platforms. They lack the capacity. Perhaps you encountered a mixed force with fleet carriers nearby, providing the fighters." Sakai wanted to argue, but felt the futility of it. He had reported what he had seen. Whether anyone believed him was beyond his control. That night, as he lay on his cot in the sweltering heat, listening to distant explosions from American bombing raids, Sakai thought about those small ships and the swarm of Hellcats they had unleashed. The Imperial Navy had spent years preparing to face America's great carriers, the symbols of their industrial might. But what if the real threat wasn't the great ships at all? What if the Americans had found a way to spread that power across dozens of smaller, more numerous platforms that could be everywhere at once? The question kept him awake long into the night. By morning, reports from other reconnaissance flights confirmed his observations. All across the waters surrounding Leyte, these escort carriers were appearing, not as isolated stragglers but as organized task groups, each launching fighters and bombers in coordinated waves. Admiral Kurita's center force, steaming confidently toward what they believed would be a decisive engagement with vulnerable landing ships, was about to discover the same terrible truth Sakai had learned in the skies over Samar. The baby flat tops were not auxiliary vessels, they were weapons, and the Americans had built hundreds of them. The transformation of American naval aviation that Sakai encountered was rooted in desperate necessity and radical industrial innovation. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the Navy possessed only 7 fleet carriers. The loss of 4 at various battles in 1942 including Lexington at Coral Sea and Yorktown at Midway, made the shortage critical. New Essex-class fleet carriers were under construction, but they required 2 years or more to build. The Navy needed flight decks immediately to protect convoys, support amphibious landings, and hunt submarines. The solution was as pragmatic as it was unprecedented. Convert merchant ship hulls into small aircraft carriers that could be built in months rather than years. The Escort carrier program began with experimental conversions of existing vessels. Ships like Long Island, converted from a merchant freighter in 1941, proved the concept viable. But it was Henry Kaiser's shipyards on the West Coast that transformed the idea into industrial reality. Kaiser's engineers designed the Casablanca-class escort carrier to be mass-produced using assembly line techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing. Each ship used a standardized Maritime Commission C-3 cargo hull, modified with a flight deck, hangar, and island superstructure. The design prioritized speed of construction over sophistication. Armor was minimal. Top speed barely reached 19 knots. But each Casablanca-class carrier could operate approximately 28 aircraft and be completed in under 3 months. Between April 1943 and July 1944, Kaiser's Vancouver shipyard launched 50 Casablanca-class carriers, an average of 1 every 6 days during peak production. This represented a revolution in naval construction. Traditional shipbuilding treated each vessel as a unique creation, crafted by specialized workers over extended timelines. Kaiser's methods treated carriers like Model T Fords, identical units assembled from interchangeable parts by workers who might have been building cargo ships months earlier. The result was a fleet of carriers that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively represented overwhelming force multiplication. The critical question facing Navy planners was what aircraft these small carriers could realistically operate. Early escort carriers had flown the F-4F Wildcat, a capable but outmatched fighter that struggled against the Zero's superior maneuverability. But by 1943, Grumman aircraft had perfected the F-6F Hellcat, designed specifically to counter Japanese fighters with overwhelming firepower and structural durability. The Hellcat was not an elegant aircraft. It was heavy, at 12,000 pounds fully loaded, with a large radial engine and thick wings. But it was also remarkably forgiving to fly and land, critical attributes for operations from short escort carrier decks. More importantly, it could absorb tremendous battle damage and still bring its pilot home. Naval aviators quickly dubbed it the aluminum tank. When trials demonstrated that Hellcats could successfully operate from escort carrier decks using catapult launches and arrested landings, it fundamentally altered the tactical equation in the Pacific. The United States Navy could now deploy frontline fighters from ships built in the time it took to train their pilots. By mid-1944, escort carrier air groups typically consisted of 12 to 18 Hellcats, plus a similar number of TBM Avenger torpedo bombers. These composite squadrons proved surprisingly effective in combat, combining the Hellcats' air superiority capabilities with the Avenger's strike power. Japanese intelligence thoroughly failed to grasp the implications of this development. Imperial Navy doctrine categorized carriers into distinct tiers: fleet carriers for offensive operations, light carriers for scouting and support, and escort carriers for defensive convoy work. The idea that an escort carrier might function offensively, launching fighter sweeps deep into contested airspace, contradicted their entire conceptual framework. Intelligence summaries from mid-1944 repeatedly dismissed escort carriers as auxiliary vessels of minimal combat value. One report from the Combined Fleet Staff in August 1944 stated, "American escort carriers lack the speed, armor, and aircraft capacity to participate in fleet actions. They are confined to rear area duties and pose no threat to our forces in decisive battle." This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. The Americans had no intention of using escort carriers in traditional fleet actions. Instead, they deployed them as distributed nodes in a vast network of air coverage that could respond flexibly to threats across enormous ocean expanses. During the Marianas invasion in June 1944, escort carriers provided continuous combat air patrol over the landing beaches, while fleet carriers engaged the Japanese mobile fleet at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. During the Palau Islands campaign in September, escort carriers supported marine landings while simultaneously conducting anti-submarine patrols and interdicting Japanese reinforcement convoys. The key advantage was numbers. By October 1944, the U.S. Navy operated over 70 escort carriers in the Pacific, compared to fewer than 20 fleet carriers. This meant American commanders could position escort carriers anywhere they anticipated needing air power, creating overlapping zones of coverage that Japanese planners found impossible to predict or counter. To Japanese pilots encountering this system for the first time, it seemed as though American carriers materialized from nowhere. Attack what appeared to be an isolated convoy, and Hellcats would appear within minutes, scout a supposedly safe anchorage, and fighters would rise to intercept. The psychological impact was profound. Japanese air crews began reporting enemy carriers everywhere, inflating estimates wildly because they couldn't distinguish between fleet carriers and the smaller escort types from altitude or through clouds. Intelligence officers dismissed these reports as panic and exaggeration, unwilling to accept that their fundamental understanding of American naval capabilities was obsolete. The stage was set for the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where this doctrinal blindness would collide with brutal reality. Admiral Kurita's center force, the most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled in 18 months, would steam directly into the teeth of the escort carrier screen, expecting auxiliary vessels, and finding instead a hurricane of American air power that would shatter his offensive before it truly began. For pilots like Saburo Sakai, watching from airfields that could barely keep planes flying, the lesson was already clear, but for the admirals commanding the fleet, sailing confidently toward what they believed would be decisive victory, the education had only just begun. The pre-dawn darkness of October 25, 1944, hung heavy over the waters east of Samar. Aboard the escort carrier USS Gambia Bay, aviation machinist's mate second-class Robert Zane checked the auxiliary fuel tank connections on a Hellcat for the third time. His hands moved automatically through the inspection routine, but his mind wandered to the intelligence briefing from the previous evening. Japanese surface forces had been detected moving through San Bernardino Strait, but higher command assured them the U.S. Navy's Third Fleet under Admiral Halsey was positioned to intercept. The escort carriers of Taffy 3, the nickname for Task Unit 77.4.3, were supposed to provide air support for ground forces on Leyte, not engage in fleet actions. That assumption would be shattered within hours. At 06:45, lookouts aboard the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts spotted pagoda masts on the northern horizon. Moments later, massive columns of water erupted around the escort carriers as Japanese heavy cruisers opened fire from 12 miles away. Admiral Kurita's center force, which should have been stopped by Third Fleet, had emerged undetected from San Bernardino Strait and now bore down on the lightly armed escort carriers with overwhelming firepower. The 6 escort carriers of Taffy 3, Gambia Bay, Fanshawe Bay, Street, Low, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, and Kitkun Bay faced 4 Japanese battleships, including the mighty Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The disparity in firepower was almost comical if it weren't so terrifying. The escort carriers were armed with a single 5-inch gun, useful for shore bombardment but utterly inadequate against armoured warships. Their thin hulls, converted from merchant ships, could be penetrated by destroyer shells, let alone the 18-inch guns of Yamato or the 8-inch rifles of the heavy cruisers. Naval doctrine said this encounter should result in the complete annihilation of the American force within 30 minutes. What happened instead became one of the most remarkable actions in naval history, driven almost entirely by the combat power of those supposedly insignificant Hellcats launching from those supposedly insignificant carriers. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable, commanding Fighting Squadron 65 aboard Fanshawe Bay, was in his cockpit when the first shells landed. His Hellcat had been spotted on the flight deck for a routine patrol mission. Through his canopy, he watched geysers of seawater, some taller than the carrier's mast, erupting in neat patterns that crept closer with each salvo. The executive officer's voice came over the flight deck loudspeaker, clipped and urgent. Launch all aircraft immediately. Arm with whatever ordnance is available. We are under attack by Japanese surface forces. Huxtable's Hellcat roared down the deck, catapult slamming him back into his seat as he became airborne with barely enough speed to stay flying. Behind him, more Hellcats launched at 30-second intervals, some armed with bombs, others with depth charges meant for submarines, still others with nothing but their 650 caliber machine guns. Within 10 minutes, Taffy 3 had launched every flyable aircraft it possessed, roughly 70 Hellcats and 30 Avenger torpedo bombers, into a desperate attempt to blunt the Japanese attack. The pilots had virtually no time to coordinate tactics. They simply flew straight at the advancing enemy warships and attacked however they could. Huxtable formed up with 4 other Hellcats from his squadron and made for the lead Japanese cruiser, which he later identified as the heavy cruiser Kumano. The warship's superstructure bristled with anti-aircraft guns that filled the air around his formation with black puffs of flak and streams of tracer fire. Huxtable pushed his Hellcat into a shallow dive, lined up the cruiser's bow in his gun sight, and held the trigger. 650 caliber Browning machine guns roared, sending a stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds across the cruiser's deck. He saw sparks and small explosions where his bullets struck gun mounts and radar equipment. The damage was superficial, he knew. 50 caliber rounds couldn't penetrate heavy cruiser armor, but it forced the Japanese gunners to take cover, disrupted their fire control, and most critically, drew attention away from the fleeing carriers. As Huxtable pulled up and banked away, anti-aircraft fire chasing him, he keyed his radio. All Hellcat flights, continuous harassment runs, don't let them aim in peace. Keep them looking up, not at our ships. For the next 2 hours, the Hellcats of Taffy 3 conducted one of the most unconventional air attacks in naval warfare. With ordnance exhausted, they made dry runs, diving toward Japanese ships without releasing weapons, forcing defensive maneuvers and disrupting gun crews. When ammunition for their machine guns ran out, they continued making passes anyway, hoping the Japanese wouldn't realize they were unarmed. Pilots described flying so close to Japanese masts they could see individual sailors on deck. The psychological effect on the Japanese was significant. From Admiral Kurita's perspective on the bridge of his flagship Yamato, the constant swarm of American aircraft suggested he faced a much larger force than intelligence had indicated. Japanese combat air patrol was virtually non-existent, fuel shortages having grounded most of their fighters, which meant the Hellcats operated with near impunity. Fire control directors aboard Japanese ships struggled to maintain targeting solutions on the fleeing carriers while simultaneously tracking dozens of attacking aircraft. The result was that Japanese gunnery, while initially accurate, became increasingly erratic as the battle progressed. But the Hellcats weren't alone. The Avenger torpedo bombers, though fewer in number, carried weapons that could genuinely threaten the Japanese warships. Lieutenant Commander William Gallagher led a section of 4 Avengers from Kitkun Bay in a torpedo attack against the heavy cruiser Chokai. The Avenger was not a fast aircraft, and its torpedo run required flying straight and level at low altitude, making it extremely vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. Gallagher's approach took him through a curtain of fire so intense that his plane shuddered from near misses. He released his Mark 13 torpedo at 800 yards range, and immediately banked hard right, his tail gunner returning fire at Japanese gun positions. The torpedo struck Chokai amidships on the starboard side, detonating below the waterline. The explosion tore a massive hole in the cruiser's hull, flooding engineering spaces and destroying power to her aft turrets. Chokai began listing almost immediately, black smoke pouring from ruptured fuel lines. While not fatal, the damage forced Chokai to fall out of formation and eventually withdraw from the battle. Other Avengers scored hits or near misses on cruisers Chikuma and Suzuya, the cumulative damage slowing the Japanese advance and creating confusion in their formation. The escort carriers themselves, meanwhile, executed desperate evasive maneuvers. Captain Walter Kalfbus of Gambier Bay ordered smoke laid and began zigzagging violently, even as Japanese shells straddled his ship. The destroyers and destroyer escorts of the screening force, USS Johnston, Howell, Samuel B. Roberts, and others, charged suicidally into the Japanese formation, launching torpedoes and drawing fire away from the carriers. It was a coordinated defense that bought precious time, every minute allowing more aircraft to attack, more smoke to obscure targets, more confusion to spread through the Japanese ranks. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. From the Japanese perspective, the battle was rapidly becoming incomprehensible. Admiral Kurita had expected to encounter auxiliary carriers with minimal air defenses. Instead, he faced aggressive, continuous air attacks that seemed to come from everywhere. Japanese after-action reports described their confusion. A message from Kumano to the flagship stated, "Under attack by approximately 50 carrier aircraft. Enemy fleet carrier group must be nearby." Kurita, uncertain whether he faced the full strength of Third Fleet rather than isolated escort carriers, made the fateful decision at 09:20 to order his scattered forces to regroup. This decision, driven largely by overestimating American strength due to the ferocity of the air attacks, allowed the surviving escort carriers to escape. By the time the Battle off Samar concluded around 9:30 a.m., the results defied all prediction. Taffy 3 had lost 2 escort carriers, Gambier Bay sunk by gunfire and Street low to a kamikaze attack, plus 3 destroyers. But Admiral Kurita's center force, despite overwhelming material superiority, had withdrawn without reaching the American landing beaches. The Japanese lost 3 heavy cruisers sunk, Chokai, Chikuma, and Suzuya, with several other vessels damaged. More significantly, they lost the initiative. Kurita would eventually turn back entirely, the invasion force he was meant to destroy remaining intact. The battle demonstrated conclusively that escort carriers, when aggressively employed, could project sufficient combat power to influence fleet actions. The Hellcats, originally designed for fleet carrier operations, proved they could operate effectively from the cramped decks of the baby flat tops, even under the most desperate circumstances. Naval historians would later identify Samar as the point where Japanese surface power in the Pacific became irrelevant, not because it was destroyed entirely, but because American air power, distributed across dozens of small carriers, made traditional gunnery engagements obsolete. You couldn't close with an enemy that could strike you from 30 miles away with massed aircraft. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. In the weeks following Leyte Gulf, Japanese intelligence finally began to comprehend what they faced. Interrogations of American prisoners and examination of captured documents revealed the scale of the escort carrier program. The realization that the United States had built over 100 small carriers, each capable of launching fighters that could challenge Japanese aircraft on equal or better terms, was devastating to Japanese strategic planning. One intelligence summary from November 1944 admitted, "The enemy has achieved mass production of auxiliary carriers carrying high-performance fighters. Our previous assessment of these vessels as non-combat auxiliaries was fundamentally incorrect. They represent a distributed air power system against which our current force structure has no effective counter." For individual Japanese pilots, the psychological burden was crushing. Saburo Sakai, recovering at a Manila hospital from wounds suffered in his latest combat mission, read the reports from Leyte with grim recognition. He had tried to warn them. The intelligence officer who had doubted his report weeks earlier was dead now, killed when his headquarters took a direct hit from American bombs. Sakai wondered if the man had ever believed, in those final moments, what Sakai had tried to tell him about those small ships and their deadly aircraft. The war would continue for another 9 months, but the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. Japanese pilots now had to assume that any American naval formation, no matter how insignificant it appeared, might suddenly launch dozens of Hellcats. The strategy of concentrating forces for decisive battle, the core of Japanese naval doctrine since Admiral Togo's victory at Tsushima in 1905, had become suicidal in an era when the enemy could be everywhere simultaneously. And that omnipresence was built not on the great fleet carriers of legend, but on humble merchant hulls carrying 20 aircraft each, mass-produced in shipyards that once built cargo vessels, and crewed by pilots who learned to fly at training fields across Middle America. The escort carriers had done what Japan's admirals said was impossible. They had made auxiliary vessels into weapons of decision, and in doing so, they had demonstrated that modern naval warfare belonged not to individual ships of overwhelming power, but to systems of coordinated platforms whose collective strength exceeded the sum of their parts. The aftermath of Leyte Gulf rippled through both American and Japanese strategic planning for the remainder of the Pacific War. For the United States Navy, the battle validated the escort carrier concept beyond anyone's expectations. These ships, initially conceived for convoy protection and anti-submarine warfare, had proven they could decisively influence fleet engagements when properly employed. The Navy responded by accelerating production and expanding the role of CVE groups in offensive operations. By December 1944, escort carriers were integrated into virtually every major amphibious operation, providing close air support, combat air patrol, and anti-kamikaze defense. The Hellcat emerged from Leyte with its reputation cemented as the finest carrier fighter of the Pacific War. Its combat record was extraordinary. By war's end, Hellcats would be credited with destroying 5,156 enemy aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter type, while achieving a kill ratio of 19-1. Approximately 45% of those victories came from Hellcats operating from escort carriers rather than fleet carriers, a testament to how completely the baby flat tops had been integrated into American air superiority strategy. The aircraft's ruggedness proved invaluable in the harsh environment of escort carrier operations, where maintenance facilities were minimal and replacement parts often scarce. Japanese responses to the new reality were desperate and improvised. With conventional air operations increasingly untenable against the swarms of Hellcats and other American fighters, Japan turned to kamikaze tactics. The Divine Wind Special Attack Corps launched its first organized missions in October 1944, targeting, ironically, the escort carriers that had so frustrated conventional attack methods. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. If you couldn't defeat American air power through aerial combat, you could try to destroy the platforms launching that air power by turning your aircraft into guided missiles. Escort carriers, with their thin armor and volatile fuel stores, were theoretically vulnerable to kamikaze attack in ways that fleet carriers were not. The kamikaze campaign would sink 5 escort carriers and damage dozens more over the subsequent months. Yet even this desperate tactic couldn't reverse the underlying strategic equation. The United States was building escort carriers faster than Japan could sink them, and training pilots faster than kamikazes could be deployed. Moreover, the defensive systems around CVE groups, combining radar-directed fighter interception, anti-aircraft artillery, and smoke screens, grew increasingly effective at disrupting suicide attacks. By mid-1945, kamikaze success rates had fallen below 5%, while American escort carrier groups continued expanding their operational reach. The human cost of this industrial warfare was profound on both sides. American casualties among CVE crews and aviators were substantial. Life aboard an escort carrier was inherently dangerous, even without enemy action. The small, cramped ships pitched heavily in Pacific swells, making flight operations hazardous. Landing accidents were common. Deck fires, inevitable with so much aviation fuel in such confined spaces, could turn catastrophic in minutes. When enemy action was added, the results could be horrific. USS Street, Lowe's destruction by kamikaze at Leyte killed 113 men. USS Bismarck C, sunk off Iwo Jima in February 1945, lost 318 of her crew. Yet the survivors continued operating, launching sorties, recovering aircraft, and maintaining the relentless pressure on Japanese forces. For Japanese aviators, the experience was psychologically devastating. Pre-war Japanese naval aviation had been built on individual excellence. Pilots trained for years to achieve mastery of their aircraft and tactics. By 1945, pilot training programs had been compressed to mere months, sending poorly trained aviators into combat against overwhelming odds. Even experienced pilots like Saburo Sakai found themselves increasingly isolated. Sakai survived the war, eventually transferred to training duties after his wounds prevented further frontline service, but watched squadron after squadron of young pilots depart for missions from which most would not return. In his post-war memoir, Samurai, Sakai described the helplessness of those final months. We could teach them how to fly, but there was not enough time to teach them how to survive. They met the Americans bravely and died quickly. The mathematical reality was inescapable. By March 1945, the United States Navy operated 119 escort carriers in active service, along with 38 fleet and light carriers. Japan's carrier force had been effectively destroyed. The few carriers that remained operational lacked fuel, aircraft, or both. American air superiority over the Pacific had become so absolute that Japanese commanders described it as the American sky, a domain they no longer contested but merely endured. This dominance enabled the final campaigns of the war, from the Philippines through Iwo Jima and Okinawa to the bombing of the Japanese home islands, all conducted under the protective umbrella of carrier-based air power. Much of it launched from those modest escort carrier decks. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the escort carriers were there, launching combat air patrols over Tokyo Bay as the surrender ceremony was conducted aboard USS Missouri. In the formation photographs from that day, you can spot several CVEs in the background, their small silhouettes overshadowed by the great battleships and fleet carriers that drew the cameras. Yet those humble ships represented something more significant than the individual giants. They embodied a revolution in warfare, the triumph of industrial mass production over traditional military craftsmanship, of distributed systems over concentrated power, of quantity achieving a quality all its own. The post-war analysis by naval strategists worldwide acknowledged that the escort carrier had fundamentally altered maritime warfare. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, in its Pacific War summary, noted, "The multiplication of flight decks through mass production of escort carriers created an air umbrella over the Pacific that Japanese forces could not penetrate or escape. This represented a paradigm shift comparable to the introduction of steam power or armor plate in the 19th century. Future naval planning would have to account for the reality that numerous modest platforms could surpass the capability of few powerful ones, provided coordination and logistics were managed effectively." Japan's post-war naval leadership, when asked to assess their defeat, repeatedly cited the escort carrier system as one of the factors they had most drastically underestimated. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who had commanded the combined fleet during the final year of the war, stated in his 1946 interrogation, "We calculated American strength based on their fleet carriers, which we could count and track. We failed to understand that they had created a second navy of smaller carriers that was in many ways more dangerous because it was unpredictable and ubiquitous. Our doctrine had no answer for an enemy that could project air power from hundreds of locations simultaneously." This admission was as close as Japanese naval doctrine would come to acknowledging that their entire strategic framework had been obsolete before the war even began. For the men who served aboard the escort carriers, the historical vindication came slowly and incompletely. The baby flat tops never captured public imagination the way the great fleet carriers like Enterprise or Yorktown did. There were no epic Hollywood films about CVE actions. The ships themselves, built for war rather than longevity, were almost entirely scrapped by the early 1950s, their utilitarian construction making them unsuitable for post-war service. Most veterans of escort carrier service returned to civilian life and spoke little of their experiences, overshadowed by the more celebrated campaigns and units. Yet their contribution was undeniable and, in many ways, more representative of how America actually won the Pacific War, through organization, production, and the coordination of thousands of ordinary individuals performing extraordinarily dangerous work with consistent competence. Retired from frontline service by 1949, examples were preserved in museums where they remain popular exhibits. Aviation enthusiasts recognize the F-6F as the most successful naval fighter of the Second World War, the aircraft that gave American pilots air superiority over the Pacific and held it until victory. Yet, even the Hellcats story is incomplete without acknowledging how many of those 5,000 victories were achieved by planes operating from the cramped decks of escort carriers, launched by catapults barely adequate for the task, recovered by arresting gear that sometimes failed, maintained by mechanics working in impossible conditions, and flown by pilots who understood that their small ships were high-priority targets with limited defense. The legacy of the escort carriers and their Hellcats extends beyond World War II. The concept of distributed air power, proven by the CVE program, influenced Cold War carrier design and strategy. Modern amphibious assault ships like the America-class LHA, essentially modern equivalents of escort carriers, carry squadrons of V-22 Ospreys and F-35B Lightning Eyes, providing air power for Marine expeditionary units, much as the Casablanca-class carriers supported ground forces in the Pacific. The fundamental principle, that numerous platforms with coordinated capabilities can dominate vast areas more effectively than a few powerful platforms, remains central to contemporary naval doctrine. In a broader sense, the escort carrier story illustrates a recurring tension in military affairs between quality and quantity, between perfection and adequacy. Japan entered the war with superior carrier-based aircraft, better trained pilots, and more combat experience than their American opponents. They lost because they could not match American industrial production and organizational flexibility. The United States built adequate ships in overwhelming numbers, crewed them with adequately trained personnel, and equipped them with increasingly superior equipment as the war progressed. The escort carrier was adequate, adequately fast, adequately armed, adequate flight deck. But when multiplied by 100 and employed intelligently, adequacy became dominance. For Saburo Sakai, who lived until 2000, the memory of that morning over Samar remained vivid. In interviews late in life, he spoke of the respect he developed for American naval aviation, not for individual heroism, which he acknowledged existed on both sides, but for the systematic thoroughness with which they approached warfare. "We fought with spirit," he reflected. "They fought with organization. In a long war, organization defeats spirit. By the time we understood this, there were baby flat tops everywhere, and Hellcats in the sky above every ocean. We had lost the sky, and losing the sky, we lost the war." Coming from one of Japan's greatest aces, the admission carried weight. Sakai had experienced firsthand the transformation from a war where individual skill mattered to one where systems and production determined outcomes. The escort carriers and their Hellcats had not just defeated the Japanese Navy, they had made the Japanese Navy's entire way of conceiving naval warfare obsolete. In the Marshall Islands, February 1945. Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Ridey sat in the ready room of USS Natoma Bay, CVE 62, watching rain streak down the portholes. Outside, the carrier's deck crew worked in the downpour, securing Hellcats against the weather while preparing for the next day's sorties supporting the invasion of Iwo Jima. Ridey had joined the squadron 4 months earlier, fresh from flight training at Pensacola. In that short time, he had flown 63 combat missions, more than many pilots flew in the entire European theatre. The pace of operations aboard escort carriers was relentless, driven by the simple reality that there were never enough aircraft for the missions required. He pulled a crumpled letter from his flight suit pocket, one he had read dozens of times. It was from his older brother, an Army Air Forces pilot flying B-17 seconds over Germany. His brother described missions flown once or twice a week, with days between for rest and maintenance. "You Navy guys have it easy," the letter joked, "just floating it around in the Pacific sunshine." Ridey smiled bitterly at that. Since joining Natoma Bay, he had not gone more than 2 consecutive days without flying combat. The previous week, he had flown 3 missions in a single day: dawn patrol, midday strike against Japanese positions on Chichi-jima, and dusk combat air patrol. His Hellcat had taken anti-aircraft fire on 2 of those missions, returning with shrapnel holes in the wing and tail section that the overworked maintenance crews patched with aluminum sheet and prayers. This was the hidden reality of the escort carrier war. The headlines celebrated the great carrier battles: Midway, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, but the daily grind of the Pacific campaign fell disproportionately on the CVE groups. They provided continuous coverage for every amphibious landing, every convoy, every damaged ship limping toward repair. They hunted submarines, intercepted reconnaissance aircraft, struck bypassed Japanese garrisons, and maintained combat air patrols over the fleet. The escort carriers were, in effect, doing the work that traditional naval doctrine said required fleet carriers, but doing it with a fraction of the resources and twice the operational tempo. By early 1945, the strain was showing. Reedy's squadron, Composite Squadron 81, had started the deployment with 24 aircraft, 16 Hellcats and 8 Avengers. They were now down to 18 aircraft operational, the others lost to combat, operational accidents, or simply worn out beyond repair. Replacement aircraft arrived sporadically. Replacement pilots, when they came at all, often had fewer flight hours than Reedy himself. The veterans taught the newcomers what they could in the brief intervals between missions, a desperate form of on-the-job training where mistakes were measured in lives lost. Yet the system worked. Somehow, impossibly, it continued to work. Natoma Bay and her sister ships maintained their operational schedules, launched and recovered aircraft with metronomic regularity, and provided the air coverage that ground forces and fleet commanders depended upon. The secret, Reedy had come to understand, was that everyone simply accepted the impossible as routine. Deck crews performed miracles of maintenance with inadequate parts. Pilots flew exhausted, knowing that the alternative was leaving their fellow servicemen without air cover. Squadron commanders squeezed performance from worn-out aircraft that by all rights should have been grounded. It was unsustainable in theory, but sustained nonetheless through sheer collective will. The Japanese, meanwhile, were experiencing the mirror image of this reality. By early 1945, Japan's naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. The few remaining carriers lacked fuel to operate. Airfields throughout the Pacific were cratered ruins. Pilot training had collapsed to the point that new aviators received perhaps 30 hours of flight time before being sent to combat, compared to the 300 hours or more that American pilots accumulated. The result was predictable. Japanese aircraft losses in the first quarter of 1945 exceeded all Japanese aircraft production for the same period. The mathematics of attrition had become simple arithmetic of annihilation. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga, one of the survivors of the Pearl Harbor attack and a veteran of every major carrier battle through Midway, found himself commanding a land-based fighter unit on Kyushu by February 1945. His squadron nominally consisted of 40 aircraft and 60 pilots. In reality, he had 12 flyable fighters, most of them obsolete models, and 18 pilots, only 3 of whom had more than 50 hours of flight time. Fuel allocations were measured in thimbles. Spare parts were non-existent. His orders were to intercept American carrier raids on the Japanese home islands, a mission that was theoretically important and practically suicidal. On February 16th, American carriers launched massive strikes against Tokyo and surrounding areas. Shiga's squadron scrambled every available aircraft to intercept. Through breaks in the clouds, he could see the American formation. Hundreds of aircraft, Hellcats, Corsairs, Avengers, and Helldivers, flying in disciplined formations that stretched across the sky. His handful of fighters climbed to engage, and within minutes, half were shot down. Shiga himself barely escaped, diving through cloud cover with 3 Hellcats on his tail, their tracers passing close enough that he felt the displacement through his control surfaces. After landing at an auxiliary field, his fuel exhausted and his aircraft damaged, Shiga sat on the wing and tried to comprehend what he had witnessed. The American formations had moved with mechanical precision, their fighters maintaining perfect defensive positions while strike aircraft proceeded to their targets unharassed. It was coordination at a scale that seemed impossible, hundreds of aircraft operating as a single organism. When he learned that many of those fighters had launched from escort carriers positioned offshore, the final piece of understanding fell into place. The Americans had built a system where individual ships and aircraft were interchangeable parts. It didn't matter if you shot down 10 Hellcats, because 20 more would be airborne within the hour. It didn't matter if you sank an escort carrier, because 3 others would move to fill the gap. This was warfare as industrial process, and Japan had no answer for it. Shiga would survive the war, one of the few Pearl Harbor pilots to do so, but his written recollections captured the despair of those final months. We were samurai fighting an assembly line. Courage meant nothing against production. Every morning we expected to die, and every evening we were surprised to still be alive. The American carriers, especially the small ones, were everywhere. They had made the ocean itself into their weapon. The invasion of Iwo Jima in February 1945 showcased the escort carrier system at peak effectiveness. 18 escort carriers supported the operation, maintaining continuous combat air patrol, providing close air support for Marines ashore, and interdicting Japanese reinforcement attempts. Over the 36 days of the battle, these CVE groups flew more than 8,000 sorties, delivering bombs, rockets, and strafing fire with precision that often placed ordnance within 100 yards of friendly forces. The Hellcats of the escort carrier squadrons claimed 147 Japanese aircraft destroyed, while losing only 18 of their own to all causes. For the Marines fighting through Iwo Jima's volcanic ash and concrete bunkers, the presence of those Hellcats overhead was both tangible and psychological. Marine Corps after-action reports repeatedly praised the responsiveness of CVE air support. Request for airstrike to actual ordnance on target averaged 12 minutes, one report noted. Accuracy was exceptional. Pilots demonstrated willingness to make repeated runs through intense anti-aircraft fire to ensure target destruction. This was the unglamorous but essential work of the escort carriers, not dramatic fleet battles, but the patient, dangerous task of supporting ground forces meter by meter across hostile islands. The final major operation of the Pacific War, the invasion of Okinawa beginning in April 1945, pushed the escort carrier force to its absolute limit. 40 escort carriers participated in the campaign, the largest concentration of CVEs in the entire war. They faced the most intense kamikaze attacks yet mounted, as Japan threw its remaining air strength into desperate attempts to halt the American advance. Between April and June, kamikazes damaged 15 escort carriers and sank USS Bismarck C. Casualties among CVE crews were heavy. Yet the system held. Damaged carriers withdrew for repair and were replaced by fresh units. Aircraft losses, though significant, were made good from the vast pool of reserve Hellcats and replacement pilots flowing across the Pacific. The Hellcats' performance at Okinawa was its final validation, operating in the most target-rich environment of the war, with hundreds of kamikaze sorties to intercept. Hellcat pilots from escort carriers claimed over 600 enemy aircraft destroyed between April and June 1945. The combat air patrols, vectored by increasingly sophisticated radar and fighter direction, intercepted kamikaze formations far from the fleet, breaking up attacks before they could develop coherence. One escort carrier pilot, Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, flying from USS Petroff Bay, perfected a tactic called the mowing machine, where a division of 4 Hellcats would position themselves in a line abreast and sweep through incoming kamikaze formations like a scythe through wheat. Valencia's division alone claimed 52 kills during the Okinawa campaign using this method. Yet victories came at a cost that statistics only partially capture. By June 1945, pilot exhaustion was becoming critical. Many CVE aviators had been in continuous combat for 8 months or more. Flight surgeons reported increasing instances of what we would now recognize as combat stress reaction, pilots experiencing tremors, insomnia, and declining performance. The Navy responded by rotating entire squadrons back to the United States for rest and retraining, replacing them with fresh units. But the pipeline of replacements was finite, and concerns were growing about whether the system could sustain the planned invasion of Japan itself. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 rendered those concerns moot. Japan surrendered on August 15th, and the escort carriers launched their final combat sorties, patrols over Tokyo Bay during the surrender ceremony on September 2nd. As the formalities concluded aboard USS Missouri, Hellcats from half a dozen escort carriers circled overhead in a final display of the air power that had made victory possible. Within weeks, the massive demobilization began. Escort carriers, built for war and unsuitable for peacetime roles, were rapidly decommissioned. Thomas Ridey returned to his family's farm in Iowa in November 1945. He brought with him 89 combat missions logged, a distinguished flying cross, and memories he would rarely discuss. His brother, the B-17 pilot, had survived 35 missions over Europe and would later joke that Thomas had flown more combat than any two European theatre pilots combined. It wasn't much of an exaggeration. The operational tempo aboard escort carriers had been nearly double that of any other aviation assignment in the war. Ridey would wake sometimes at night, hearing the sound of the catapult, the sudden acceleration that had launched him into combat so many times that it became a physical reflex his body could not forget. Saburo Sakai returned to Japan and found a nation transformed by defeat and occupation. He worked various civilian jobs, eventually becoming a printer, and lived quietly until American aviation historians discovered him in the 1950s. His memoir, published in 1957, became an international bestseller and introduced Western readers to the Japanese pilot's perspective on the Pacific War. In numerous interviews over the subsequent decades, Sakai was consistently gracious toward his former enemies, praising American pilots' skill and courage. But when asked what single factor most contributed to Japan's defeat in the air, his answer never varied. "Your escort carriers. We could not believe that so many ships carrying so many aircraft could exist. By 1945, we called them ghost carriers because they appeared everywhere and nowhere. You had made air power infinite. Against infinity, courage is irrelevant." The post-war fate of the Hellcat mirrored that of the escort carriers. Most were scrapped by 1950, their wartime utility not translating to peacetime needs. A few foreign air forces operated Hellcats into the 1950s, but by then they were obsolete, superseded by jets. Some found civilian use as racing aircraft or aerial firefighters, their rugged construction serving new purposes. Perhaps 50 survive today in museums and private collections, immaculately restored examples of the aircraft that claimed more aerial victories than any other American fighter in history. Aviation enthusiasts recognize the Hellcat's distinctive profile: the thick wings, the large radial engine, the solid, workmanlike appearance that perfectly captured its design philosophy of rugged effectiveness over aesthetic elegance. The escort carriers themselves vanished almost without trace. Of the 128 American escort carriers built during World War II, none survive today. The last, USS Annapolis, was scrapped in 1976. Unlike fleet carriers, which were expensive enough that the Navy sought to extend their service lives through modernization, the CVEs were too basic, too slow, and too lightly built to justify post-war retention. They had been built to serve a specific purpose in a specific war, and once that war ended, they became obsolete. Some were sold to foreign navies and served another decade or two before scrapping. Others were converted to merchant use, their military equipment removed and cargo holds installed. Most went directly from decommissioning to the breaker's yard, their steel recycled into the post-war economy they had helped preserve. Yet the concept they proved endured. Every modern navy that operates aircraft carriers understands the principle the escort carriers demonstrated: that distributed platforms with coordinated capabilities provide more flexible and resilient power projection than concentrated platforms alone. The escort carrier's descendant might be the America-class amphibious assault ship or even the distributed drone networks being developed for future conflicts. The specific technology changes, but the underlying insight remains valid. Many adequate platforms can achieve dominance that few perfect platforms cannot. The men who served aboard the escort carriers and flew their aircraft rarely spoke of themselves as revolutionaries. They were simply doing their jobs under extraordinarily difficult circumstances, but they participated in a fundamental transformation of naval warfare. Before World War II, Aircraft carriers were rare and precious assets, employed cautiously and concentrated for decisive battles. The Escort carrier program demonstrated that carriers could be built quickly, cheaply, and in sufficient numbers to make air power ubiquitous rather than concentrated. This transformation made possible the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, enabled the massive amphibious assaults that characterized the war's final years, and ultimately ensured that Japan could never regain the initiative after Midway. The Japanese admirals who mocked the baby flat tops learned, too late, that their contempt was misplaced. Those small ships represented something more threatening than individual combat power. They represented industrial capacity translated directly into military capability, the ability to turn factories and resources into floating air bases faster than the enemy could destroy them. In a war of attrition, this capacity was decisive. Japan could not match American production, even at its pre-war peak. By 1945, with factories bombed, resources exhausted, and skilled workers depleted, Japan's industrial capacity was a fraction of America's. The Escort carriers were both symbol and instrument of this disparity. The Battle of Samar, where Japanese battleships retreated from converted merchant ships launching fighters, became emblematic of this reversal. What should have been annihilation became escape, because the Japanese could not comprehend or effectively counter what they faced. Their doctrine, their training, their entire conceptual framework for naval warfare had prepared them to fight fleet carriers in decisive engagements. The Escort carriers bypassed that framework entirely, spreading air power so broadly that decisive engagement became impossible to achieve. The samurai found themselves checkmated not by a superior warrior, but by an opponent who had changed the nature of the contest entirely. In the end, the story of the Japanese admirals and the Escort carriers is a story about underestimation and transformation. The admirals underestimated American industrial capacity and organizational flexibility. They assumed that because Escort carriers were individually weak, they would be collectively ineffective. They were wrong on both counts. The Americans transformed naval warfare by demonstrating that numerous modest platforms, properly coordinated, could achieve what few powerful platforms could not: omnipresence. And omnipresence, in warfare as in nature, creates its own invincibility. You cannot defeat what is everywhere. When historians assess the Pacific War, they often focus on the dramatic turning points: Midway, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf. These battles were undeniably important, but the real story of how America won the Pacific may lie in the less dramatic but more persistent reality of those Escort carriers and their Hellcats, launching sortie after sortie, day after day, month after month, from dozens of small decks scattered across the ocean. They made American victory inevitable, not through decisive battle, but through persistent presence, not through individual heroism, though there was plenty of that, but through systematic application of industrial power. The Japanese admirals who laughed at Escort carriers learned what empires throughout history have eventually learned: that mockery of an opponent's methods is dangerous when those methods work. The baby flat tops worked. The Hellcats they launched crushed Japan's remaining air power and made possible the final campaigns of the war. And in doing so, they demonstrated that in modern industrial warfare, there is no substitute for the ability to produce adequate weapons in overwhelming quantity and employ them with competent consistency. The ocean that had once belonged to Japan's powerful fleet carriers became an American lake, patrolled by humble merchant hulls that learned to launch thunder. 500 Hellcats, rising from ships that weren't supposed to matter, had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. The admirals who had laughed were no longer laughing. They were simply trying to survive the storm they had failed to predict and could not stop. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.